The road is a ribbon of baked clay cutting through the suffocating green of a Harlan County summer. The year is 1905. The air is so thick with heat and humidity you can taste it. Metallic and sweet, like blood and honeysuckle. In a rickety wagon, a man's hand rests on the stock of a Winchester rifle. The cold steel a stark contrast to the sweat beading on his knuckles. He is a Sheffield, the third generation to know this road, and the third to know the fear that comes with it. He's supposed to be on his way to town for salt and flour, but his eyes aren't on the path ahead. They're scanning the dense tree line, searching for a flicker of movement, a glint of sun on a rifle barrel. The only sounds are the rhythmic creak of the wagon wheels and the drone of cicadas. A sound so constant it becomes a form of silence. Then, a new sound, the sharp crack of a twig under a heavy boot. The cicadas stop. The world holds its breath. A single shot rings out, a violent punctuation mark in the oppressive quiet, and the scene erupts into a storm of gunfire from the woods. This wasn't war. It wasn't law enforcement. It was simply family business. For the Sheffields and the Taylors of Appalachian Kentucky, this kind of ambush had become as routine as the planting season, as predictable as the winter snow. But how does a grudge between two neighbors fester for so long that it consumes 5 generations? How does hatred become an inheritance, passed down from father to son with the same solemnity as a pocket watch or a parcel of land? The answer isn't found in a grand betrayal or a monumental crime. It lies in something far smaller, almost insignificant. A single, misplaced comma in the story of 2 families. A mistake in judgment. A poorly worded land deed. A misunderstood insult that spiraled into a century of bloodshed. This is the anatomy of a feud, a case study in how the smallest of errors, when watered with pride and isolation, can grow into a forest of ruin. To understand the war, you must first understand the world that created it. Post-Civil War Appalachia was a land apart, a labyrinth of hills and hollows that insulated its people from the rapidly changing nation around them. Here, the government in Washington, or even in Frankfurt, was a distant, foreign entity. The true law was older, etched not in books, but in bloodlines. Clan loyalty was absolute. An insult to one man was an insult to his entire family, his cousins, his kin. Honor was the only real currency, and a man's word was his bond. Justice was not something you sought from a judge in a black robe. It was a private matter, a debt to be settled personally, often with fists, and just as often with firearms. This wasn't a lawless society. It was a society with its own fierce, unwritten code, and a long memory for any who dared to break it. Into this world were born William Sheffield and John Taylor. They were not monsters. They were patriarchs, hardened men forged by the unforgiving landscape. They were neighbors, men who likely shared a drink, traded livestock, and watched their children grow up in the same narrow valley. The misplaced comma, the original sin of their feud, is lost to the mists of folklore, as most such beginnings are. Local stories suggest it was a dispute over a property line where a fence was moved by a few feet, stealing a sliver of pasture. Others claim it began with a stray hog that wandered from a Taylor farm and ended up on a Sheffield dinner table. Perhaps it was a business deal gone sour, a handshake agreement that one man remembered differently than the other. The specific cause is ultimately irrelevant. What mattered was the outcome. One family felt cheated. The other felt their honor had been questioned. In the charged atmosphere of the mountains, this was an impossible impasse. To back down was to lose face, to be seen as weak, and weakness was a death sentence in a land where survival depended on strength and reputation. The patriarchs, trapped by the rigid code they lived by, could not yield. The initial disagreement wasn't settled with reason or compromise. It festered, poisoning the air between the 2 homesteads. The comma, that tiny pause where a resolution could have been found, was ignored. The point of no return arrived not in a calculated ambush, but in the chaos of a public gathering. It might have been at a town market, a church social, or a local election day, a place where paths were bound to cross. A heated exchange, fueled by simmering resentment and mountain whiskey, escalated. Shouts became shoves. Shoves became a brawl. And in the dirt and the dust, a knife was drawn, or a pistol was fired. The first blood was spilled. In that single, fatal moment, the feud was cemented. The argument was no longer about a pig or a fence line. It was about a life. The unwritten law of the mountains was clear and unforgiving. Blood for blood. The comma had been erased and replaced with a period. The conversation was over. The war had begun. The first generation started the fire. The second was born to tend it. For the sons of William Sheffield and John Taylor, the original grievance over land or livestock was an abstract piece of family lore. They didn't inherit a dispute. They inherited a blood debt. The feud became their birthright, an inescapable part of their identity. To be a Sheffield was to hate a Taylor, and to be a Taylor was to hunt a Sheffield. The nature of the violence changed accordingly. It shed its chaotic, emotional origins and became something colder, more strategic. Spontaneous brawls at the town market gave way to calculated ambushes on lonely mountain roads. Nighttime raids on family homesteads replaced drunken arguments. Each family began to operate less like a collection of relatives and more like a paramilitary unit. The eldest son often became the de facto CEO, the strategist who dictated the terms of engagement. His brothers and cousins served as his lieutenants, his soldiers in a private war. Their business was no longer farming or logging. It was survival, and their primary product was retribution. They learned the terrain not as farmers, but as guerrilla fighters. They knew which hollows provided the best cover for an attack, which ridges offered a clear line of sight, and which creeks could mask the sound of their approach. The family Bible might still sit on the mantle, but the real scripture was written in spent cartridges and fresh graves. Even in this brutal conflict, a twisted code of conduct often emerged. These were unwritten rules of war understood by both sides. In many Appalachian feuds, there was a tacit agreement that women and children were off-limits, considered non-combatants in a war fought by men. There might be informal truces during the harvest season, when the survival of both families depended on getting the crops in, or on major holidays like Christmas. But these were fragile agreements, easily shattered by a perceived slight or an act of betrayal. One of the most legendary events from this era was the Courthouse Massacre, a shootout that erupted on the steps of the county seat, a chance encounter between two armed groups, there for unrelated legal matters, turned the town square into a free fire zone. When the smoke cleared, the local sheriff and 3 men, 2 Taylors and 1 Sheffield, lay dead. The event solidified the feud's reputation for savagery and proved that no place was truly neutral ground. It also demonstrated the utter impotence of the law. Local sheriffs were often related to one clan or another, or simply too outgunned and intimidated to intervene. Harlan County became a self-contained war zone, policing itself with rifle and revolver. Then, in 1920, the United States government inadvertently poured gasoline on this smoldering fire. The 18th Amendment was passed, and prohibition became the law of the land. For the isolated mountain communities of Kentucky, this wasn't a moral crusade. It was a business opportunity. The hills and hollows that had once served as tactical advantages in a feud were now perfect locations for hiding illegal moonshine stills. Suddenly, the conflict between the Sheffields and the Taylors was no longer just about honor and revenge. It was about money. Big money. The feud transformed from a personal vendetta into a violent corporate rivalry. The families were now competing criminal enterprises, battling for control of the lucrative bootlegging trade. Their war was now fought over territory, access to resources like corn and sugar, control of the best copper craftsmen for building stills, and dominance over the distribution networks that moved the whiskey out of the mountains and into the thirsty cities. The violence became more professional, more ruthless. Killing a rival was no longer just settling a blood debt. It was eliminating a business competitor. An ambush on a backcountry road wasn't just revenge. It was a hostile takeover of a rival's delivery route. The corporate analogy became chillingly accurate. Each clan had its own organizational chart. The patriarch or eldest son was the CEO, making the strategic decisions. Beneath him were the enforcers, the muscle who protected the stills and dealt with threats. There were the distillers, the craftsmen with the valuable knowledge of how to make the product. There were the runners, the daring drivers who risked their lives navigating treacherous roads with cars full of illicit liquor, constantly evading both rival clans and federal revenue agents. And there were the accountants, often the women of the family, who managed the finances, laundered the money through local businesses, and kept the operation solvent. Their tactics evolved, mirroring those of urban gangs in Chicago or New York. They used fear as a tool to control the local population, ensuring silence from neighbors who might otherwise report them to the authorities. Cooperation was rewarded. Betrayal was met with swift and brutal consequences. A burned barn or a dead mule served as a powerful warning. They engaged in industrial espionage, sending spies to discover the location of a rival's hidden still, which would then be destroyed in a nighttime raid, not just to hurt the enemy, but to absorb their market share. This period reveals a perverse ingenuity born from generations of conflict. The Sheffields and the Taylors were no longer just feuding farmers clinging to an archaic code of honor. They were seasoned, organized criminals, applying the brutal lessons of their family war to the cutthroat world of illegal enterprise. The misplaced comma that started it all had been forgotten, buried under a mountain of cash and corpses. The feud now had a balance sheet, and profit and loss were calculated in blood. The fourth and fifth generations of Sheffields and Taylors were born into a world where the feud was the only constant. They didn't know the story of the misplaced comma, the stray hog, or the disputed fence line. They only knew that the other family was the enemy, a hereditary stain that had to be cleansed with violence. The children played games of ambush in the woods, using sticks for rifles, practicing for a future that was already decided for them. The original cause was a ghost, a forgotten myth. The war was the only reality. By the late 1930s, the Great Depression and the eventual repeal of Prohibition had crippled their criminal enterprises. The river of easy money had dried up, leaving only the bedrock of pure, distilled hatred. The families were smaller now, whittled down by nearly a century of attrition. The men who remained were the hardest of the hard, survivors of countless gunfights, their souls cauterized by loss and paranoia. The violence became less strategic and more nihilistic. It was no longer about controlling territory. It was about extermination. The final act was not a single, climactic battle, but a slow, agonizing collapse. It came in the form of a betrayal from within. A young Taylor, weary of a war he never chose, secretly met with federal agents. He traded the locations of his family's last remaining strongholds for a new identity and a train ticket west. The subsequent raids were swift and brutal. The law, which had been a nuisance for decades, now became an instrument of annihilation. The remaining Sheffields, seeing their rivals fall, launched one final, desperate assault, believing they could wipe out the last of the Taylors in the chaos. This final gunfight, waged in the muddy streets of the same town where the first blood was shed, was a suicidal frenzy. It ended when the last two patriarchs, an aging Sheffield and a battle-scarred Taylor, found themselves face to face, their rifles empty. They ended their family war not with a bang, but with a brutal, clumsy fight with knives and fists, until both men bled out in the dirt, surrounded by the ghosts of their ancestors. The feud had finally consumed itself. The last male heirs were either dead, imprisoned for life, or had vanished into the wider country, abandoning their cursed names. There was no victory, only an eerie, profound silence that fell over the valley. Today, if you travel those same back roads in Harlan County, you will find no monuments to the Sheffield-Taylor War. The homesteads have been swallowed by the forest, their stone chimneys standing like lonely tombstones. In the Old Town Cemetery, you can find the graves, rows of Sheffields and Taylors, separated in death by only a few feet of soil. Their shared history of violence, the only thing that binds them. The story of their feud is now a local ghost story, a cautionary tale told in hushed tones about the dangers of pride and the poison of an unforgiven wrong. The journey from a simple dispute to mutual destruction is a testament to a terrible truth. A small, fixable error, a misplaced comma in the human contract, when amplified by isolation, a rigid code of honor, and generations of resentment, can spiral into absolute ruin. The specific circumstances of their war may belong to the past, but the underlying human tendencies are timeless. The tribalism that pits us against them, the inability to forgive, the terrifying momentum of escalating conflict, these are dangers that still haunt the modern world. In the end, no one remembers the misplaced comma. No one remembers the plot of land or the price of the stolen pig. All that's left is the silence where 5 generations of 2 families used to be. A testament to the fact that the longest wars are often fought over the smallest things, and the highest price is always paid in blood. If this exploration of a forgotten American tragedy resonated with you, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more deep dives into the hidden corners of history. Let us know in the comments what other stories of conflict and consequence you believe need to be told. Thank you for watching.